The dog knew the truth. 2 years ago, my 8-year-old daughter disappeared for 3 days. During those 3 days, I learned that my husband, whom I'd mourned for 3 years, was alive. That his mother had lied to my face at his funeral. That my little girl was braver than all of us adults. And that our German Shepherd, Max, had known the truth all along. Dogs don't know how to lie. It didn't start on that Tuesday in October when the school called me at work with news that stopped my heart. It started 3 days earlier, on Saturday, when Max began acting strange. I work as a manager at a logistics company in Portland, Oregon. Normal life, a house in the Beaverton suburbs, 2 kids, a widow for 3 years. I'm 47, and I thought I'd learned how to cope with pain, that the worst was behind me. That night 3 years ago, when police knocked on my door with news of the accident. But I was wrong. That Saturday, Max wouldn't eat. Our German Shepherd, who usually cleared his bowl in under a minute, refused breakfast. He stood by the front door and whined softly. My oldest son, Ethan, a 17-year-old who adored this dog, tried to take Max for a walk. But the dog resisted. He pulled the leash not toward the park as usual, but in the opposite direction, toward the industrial zone on the edge of town. Ethan came back puzzled, said Max was acting like he was searching for someone. I didn't think much of it. Dogs can be strange sometimes. They have their own instincts. On Sunday, Max didn't sleep at all. All night he paced through the house, scratching at doors, whining. I came downstairs to the kitchen at 3 in the morning and saw him sitting at the window, staring toward the western part of the city, where the old warehouses and abandoned industrial buildings were. Ears perked, whole body tense. I petted his head and told him everything was okay. But Max looked at me as if he wanted to say something, as if he was trying to warn me. Monday morning, my youngest daughter Emily came down to breakfast with red eyes. 8 years old, blonde braids, freckles on her nose. Usually, she chattered nonstop at breakfast about school, about friends, about the new book she was reading. But that morning she was silent. She pushed her scrambled eggs around with her fork and said nothing. I asked what was wrong. Emily looked at me, then at Max, who was sitting next to her chair with his head on her lap. She petted the dog and said she just hadn't slept well. Had a strange dream about Dad. My heart squeezed. 3 years had passed since David died. Emily was only 5 when it happened. She remembered her father vaguely. Kind eyes, strong arms that tossed her toward the ceiling, the smell of his cologne. But his face was already fading from memory. I hugged my daughter and said Dad would always be with us in our hearts. Empty words that all parents say. I didn't know how empty they would turn out to be. Emily nodded and went to pack her backpack for school. Max stayed right beside her. Usually the dog dozed on his bed in the morning, but that morning he followed Emily everywhere. When the school bus took my daughter away, Max howled. He stood at the window and howled so loud the neighbors looked out of their houses. Ethan said maybe the dog was sick, suggested taking him to the vet. But I looked into Max's eyes and understood. He wasn't sick. He knew something we didn't know. That Monday evening, I was making dinner when I heard Emily talking to someone upstairs in her room. I climbed the stairs and peeked through the half-open door. My daughter was sitting on the floor with her arms around Max's neck, whispering something in his ear. The dog sat motionless, like a statue, and listened. His brown eyes looked at the girl with such understanding that goosebumps ran down my spine. I asked who she was talking to. Emily flinched, let go of Max, and said she was just playing. But her expression wasn't childlike, the look of a person who had made some kind of decision. That night, Max didn't sleep again. He lay by the door of Emily's bedroom and never took his eyes off her. I woke at 2 a.m. with a strange feeling of anxiety. I went upstairs and saw this picture: the dog on guard, the girl asleep, hugging her pillow. I went back to bed, but couldn't sleep. Something was wrong. Something hung in the air of our house, some premonition, but I couldn't understand what. Tuesday morning, Emily left for school as usual, kissed my cheek, waved to Ethan, petted Max. The dog tried to follow her, but I held his collar. Max lunged so hard I barely held on. He barked, whined, scratched the floor with his paws, tried to break free and run after the school bus. That was the last time I saw my daughter for 3 days. At 2 p.m, I got a call from the school. The principal's secretary, Mrs. Henderson, her voice shaking, said Emily hadn't returned after lunch, that her teacher had waited for her in class, but the girl never came back, that they'd searched the entire school, checked the bathrooms, library, gym. Emily was nowhere. I dropped everything and rushed to the school. On the way, I called Ethan, David's mother, the police. The world narrowed to one thought: find Emily. Find my little girl. When I pulled into the school parking lot, police cars were already there. Detective Morrison, a woman about 50 with tired eyes, met me at the entrance. She said they'd started a search, that they'd interviewed classmates, teachers, cafeteria staff. Classmates had seen Emily leave the cafeteria after lunch. She told her friend Kylie she was going to the bathroom, but she never went to the bathroom. Security cameras showed her leaving through the back exit of the school, the one that led to the staff parking lot. And after that, nothing, as if she'd vanished into thin air. They found her backpack an hour later in a park 2 blocks from the school. The bright pink backpack with unicorns that Emily had chosen for the first day of school. It was sitting on a bench, neatly zipped. Inside, textbooks, pencil case, water bottle, and a note. In childish handwriting, in pencil, on a page torn from a notebook. I know where Dad is. Don't worry. Coming back soon. Emily. Detective Morrison showed me the note in a clear evidence bag. I read those words over and over, but they didn't make sense. Where's Dad? What Dad? David died 3 years ago. We buried him. I stood by the grave and threw a handful of dirt on the coffin. Morrison asked if Emily might have misunderstood something. Maybe one of the relatives had said something. Maybe she'd found some of her father's old things and decided he was somewhere out there. Children's fantasy, children's logic. I said I didn't know. That the last few days, Emily had been acting strange, looking at me somehow differently, but I hadn't paid attention to it. Police began combing through the park and surrounding area. Volunteers started arriving. Neighbors, parents from school, strangers brought by news on television. Everyone wanted to help find the missing girl. 8 years old, blonde hair, blue jacket, pink backpack. But they'd already found the backpack. The girl was gone. Ethan rushed over from school. My 17-year-old son, who usually maintained an independent and cool demeanor, looked like a frightened child. He asked what happened to Emily, what was going on. I didn't know what to answer. David's mother, Martha, arrived half an hour later. An elderly woman of 72, always collected and calm, looked pale. She hugged me, said everything would be okay, that Emily would be found, that it was a misunderstanding. But her hands were shaking. I asked if she'd said anything to Emily about David recently. Martha shook her head, said she hadn't discussed her father with her granddaughter in a long time. That why stir up the past? But she wouldn't meet my eyes. By evening, the search had yielded no results. They'd combed the park, walked the nearby streets, checked bodies of water. Nothing. Emily had seemingly evaporated. Police advanced a theory of abduction, that someone might have lured the girl using her father's memory, that it was a planned crime. An Amber Alert was sent throughout the state. Emily's photo on all news channels, a tip line for information. I sat in the police station giving statements, answering questions, staring at a computer screen where the detective filled out forms. And at home remained Ethan and Max. Ethan called me at 9 in the evening, voice worried, said Max was going crazy, that the dog was barking, howling, scratching the front door, that he'd taken the dog outside, and Max had bolted with such force he'd yanked the leash out of his hands, ran off, not toward the park where they'd found the backpack, in the opposite direction, toward the western part of the city, toward the industrial zone. Ethan ran after the dog, caught up only 3 blocks later. Max was standing at an intersection barking toward the old warehouses, those same abandoned ones where no one had worked for about 10 years, an area fenced with rusty wire and signs reading "No trespassing, danger of collapse." Ethan barely managed to drag Max home. My son told me on the phone that the dog was acting as if he could smell Emily there, at the warehouses, but that was impossible. Police were searching the park, on the other side of town. All the evidence pointed there. I told Ethan to stay home, keep Max there. I'd be back soon. But I didn't get back until late at night. Police were planning the next day's search, expanded area, more volunteers, a helicopter with thermal imaging, a professional search and rescue team with dogs. When I walked into the house, Max was sitting by the door, not barking, just sitting and looking at me. In his eyes was something like disappointment, as if he was saying, "You're searching in the wrong place. Why won't you listen to me?" I got down on my knees and hugged the dog. Max put his head on my shoulder and whined softly. That sound broke my heart. Ethan sat on the couch, still dressed, said he couldn't sleep, that he couldn't just lie in bed while Emily was out there somewhere. I sat next to him, and we were silent. There were no words for what we felt. Around 2 in the morning, I finally made Ethan lie down. I lay on the couch myself, still dressed. Max settled on the floor nearby. Didn't sleep. I could see his ears twitch at every sound from outside. I didn't sleep either. I thought about the note. "I know where Dad is." What did that mean? Where could Emily have learned something? David died 3 years ago. Car accident on Highway 26. Coming home late from work. The car went off the road into a ravine, caught fire. His mother identified the body. I couldn't look. Closed casket at the funeral. After the funeral, my mother-in-law, Martha, said she'd received insurance payments from David's policy, that every month I'd get money for the kids. She handed me envelopes, 1,000, 1,500, sometimes 2. Said it was from the insurance. Together with my manager's salary, it was enough. We lived modestly but without debt. But what if... No, that was madness. David was dead. I stood at his grave. I saw the coffin. I received the death certificate, but the note. Wednesday morning, I woke to a phone call. Detective Morrison said they were starting the search in the expanded area, that I should stay home in case Emily came back on her own or someone called, that they'd keep me informed. I couldn't just sit at home. Said I was going to David's mother's house, that I wanted to talk to her again, that maybe she'd remember something important. Martha lived in the Gresham suburbs, 20 minutes drive from us. A small house with a garden where she grew roses. The house where David grew up. The house where I first met his parents 20 years ago. Martha opened the door with red eyes. Hadn't slept, like me. Said she'd been praying all night. That she was sure Emily would be found. That God would protect her. I walked into the house and immediately asked, what could Emily have overheard? What might Martha have said to someone on the phone or in front of her granddaughter? Any little thing, any mention of David. Martha was flustered, said she didn't remember, that the last time Emily was with her was 2 weeks ago. She'd been sick, stayed for the day while I was at work. A normal day, nothing special. I asked if maybe someone had called. Maybe she'd talked to someone about David when Emily was there. Martha thought about it, then said yes. There'd been one call. A friend had called, offering condolences about the anniversary of David's death. 3 years had passed. Martha had talked to her in the kitchen while Emily watched cartoons in the living room. The girl couldn't have heard, but something in her voice was wrong. Some false note. I asked if I could look around the house, check the room where Emily had been. Maybe the girl had left some traces, notes, something that would hint at what she'd been thinking. Martha nodded, led me upstairs to the guest bedroom where Emily slept when she stayed with her grandmother. I examined the room. Nothing unusual. Neatly laid bed. A stack of children's books on the nightstand. David's old toys on a shelf. A stuffed bear. A wooden car. Then I noticed the trash can. Inside was a crumpled envelope. I pulled it out and smoothed it. An ordinary white envelope. No return address. Portland postmark. Addressed to Martha Thompson. The envelope had been opened. There was no letter inside. I asked Martha what this letter had been. She looked at the envelope and went pale. Said she didn't remember. Some advertisement, probably. Threw it away without reading. But she was lying. I could see it on her face. I asked directly, "Who was this letter from, Martha?" The old woman sank onto the edge of the bed. Her hands trembled. She was silent for a long time. Then she looked up at me, eyes full of tears. Said I had to understand that all of this was for protection, that David didn't want to put us in danger, that he had no choice. The world tilted. I held on to the back of a chair and asked, what was she talking about? What protection? What danger? David was dead. Martha shook her head. Tears ran down her cheeks. She said quietly, "No, Sarah, he's not dead." I don't remember how I ended up on the floor. Don't remember screaming. I only remember Martha crying and talking, and I couldn't understand the words. They fell on me like stones. David was alive. For 3 years he'd been alive, a staged death. Debts, dangerous people, threats to the family. The only way to protect us was to disappear. Pretend to be dead, go far away, no contact. Martha was the only one who knew. David contacted only her, rarely, through encrypted email at first, then through letters from different cities. Sent money through Western Union. Martha told me it was insurance money. I'd been living on money from a man I mourned. I asked where he was. Where was David now? Martha said she didn't know exactly. The last letter had come 2 months ago, from Portland. He'd come back, paid off his debts, wanted to see the kids, but he was afraid I'd hate him, that the kids wouldn't forgive him, that it was better to stay dead to everyone. The letter had an address, where he worked. Burnside Warehouses, guard post number 7, night security. I remembered Max, how the dog had pulled toward the warehouses, how he barked in that direction, how he'd looked at me with reproach. Max knew. The dog knew David was there, smelled his scent on the wind, recognized the smell of the man who'd brought him home as a puppy 4 years ago. The smell that lingered on David's old jacket that Ethan sometimes wore. Emily knew too. My 8-year-old girl had somehow found out. Maybe she'd seen the envelope with the address. Maybe she'd overheard her grandmother's phone conversation. Maybe she just felt it, the way children do, and she went to find her father. Alone, 8 years old, across the entire city, to the dangerous, abandoned warehouses. I jumped to my feet and ran for the exit. Martha shouted after me that she'd call the police, that they'd go check. But I wasn't listening. I ran to my car. On the way, I called Ethan, yelled into the phone for him to take Max and drive to Burnside Warehouses immediately. Didn't explain why. There was no time. I raced through the city, breaking every rule. My heart beat so hard it felt ready to leap from my chest. Thoughts tangled. David was alive. Emily had been searching for him. Max knew. All these days the dog had tried to tell us, and we hadn't listened. Burnside Warehouses were in the industrial zone in West Portland, a huge area of abandoned buildings, closed off by a rusty fence, a sign at the gate, private property, no trespassing. I drove through the broken gates, wound between old hangars and warehouses, concrete boxes with broken windows, graffiti on the walls, trash and rusted containers. I looked for guard post number 7, found it in the far corner of the property, a small trailer with dirty windows, light glowing inside. I jumped out of my car and ran to the trailer. The door was ajar. Inside sat a man, back to me, dark hair with gray, broad shoulders in a work jacket. He turned at the sound of my footsteps. David, older, tired, with wrinkles that hadn't been there 3 years ago. But David, my dead husband, was alive. And next to him on an old couch, Emily slept. My girl, whole, alive, covered with his jacket. I don't remember what I screamed. Don't remember if I cried or laughed. I only remember Emily waking up and throwing herself at me, hugging me so tight I couldn't breathe. She said she'd found Dad. That Dad wasn't dead. That now we'd be a family again. A child's voice, full of hope and joy. An 8-year-old girl who'd accomplished the impossible, brought her father back from the dead. David stood to the side, didn't approach, looked at us and said nothing, face full of guilt and fear. I held Emily and looked at him. This man I'd lived with for 15 years, whom I'd loved, whom I'd mourned, who had abandoned us, who thought he was protecting us. He started talking, explaining. Words tumbled out slowly, with pauses, as if each one caused pain. 4 years ago, he'd gotten into a situation. He was working as a long-haul truck driver then. The company seemed legitimate, but one of the runs turned out to be transporting drugs. He didn't know. When he found out, it was too late. The cargo was arrested at the state border. He was interrogated. He told the truth, didn't know about the contents. They let him go. But the people whose cargo was arrested didn't let it go. They found him, said he owed them $100,000 for the botched deal, for the lost product. He tried to explain he wasn't at fault. They didn't listen. They made threats. To him, to me, to the kids. Photos of our house. Ethan's route to school. The daycare where Emily went at the time. David understood he couldn't just walk away from these people. Couldn't hide while his family was alive. They'd find him through us. Would pressure him through us. The only way to protect us was to die. To really die for everyone. For the police, for these people, for family. He planned everything through his mother, an old car, registered in someone else's name. A highway with sharp turns, a fire that would destroy everything, a body that wasn't actually in the car. He'd used a corpse from the morgue through an acquaintance who worked there. Martha officially identified the body, closed casket, as appropriate after a fire. The police closed the case as an accident. The criminals he owed read the news in the papers. David Thompson died. Case closed. They left us alone, and David went to Texas, worked on oil rigs under a false name. Every cent he sent to his mother. 3 years, one after another. Lived in a barracks with 10 other men. Worked 12-hour days. Didn't drink, didn't spend money on himself. Just worked and thought about us. 6 months ago, he learned those people had gone to prison. A major FBI operation. The entire syndicate arrested. The threat was gone. David came back to Portland. Found work as a night security guard here, at the warehouses. Lived in this trailer. Didn't rent an apartment. Saved every dollar for us. Wanted to save up enough to come back. Somehow explain. Somehow atone. But didn't know how. Wrote to his mother that he was afraid. That we'd hate him. That the kids wouldn't forgive. That maybe it was better to stay dead. That it was more honest that way. 2 days ago, Tuesday afternoon, he heard a knock on the trailer door. Opened it and saw Emily, 8 years old, in a blue jacket with a pink backpack, standing on the threshold looking at him with huge eyes. She recognized him. Despite 3 years, despite being only 5 when he died, she recognized him. Said simply, "Dad, I knew you were alive. Let's go home." David didn't know what to do. Called his mother in a panic. Martha said police were looking for the girl, that an alert had been issued, that he needed to return her immediately. But Emily was crying, begging him not to give her back until he promised to come home to us. Children's logic. If Dad promises, he'll keep his word. If she goes back alone, Dad will disappear again. David couldn't refuse her. Said he'd think about it, that he'd decide, that soon everything would be okay. Fed her from his supplies, canned food, bread, water. Covered her with his jacket because it was cold in the trailer. Didn't let her go outside, afraid someone would see. 2 days they spent in that trailer, talking. He told her about Texas, about the rigs, about how much he'd missed her. She told him about school, about Ethan, about me, about Max, the dog he'd brought home as a puppy a month before his death. Max had been his idea. He'd taken a puppy from the oil rig. A stray dog had birthed a litter there. David brought one puppy home and told the kids it was a gift. Did it say it was a goodbye gift? That in a month he'd disappear forever. But the dog remembered him. 4 years later, Max recognized David's scent on the wind. A scent that drifted from the warehouses to our house in Beaverton. 30 kilometers, but the wind sometimes blew from the west, and Max could smell it. The dog tried to tell us, pulled toward the warehouses, howled, scratched doors. But we didn't understand. People are too stupid to listen to dogs. I stood in that trailer, holding Emily and listening to the voice of the man who had been my husband. Didn't know what to feel. Anger? He'd abandoned us. Relief? He was alive. Terror? My daughter could have died looking for him. Gratitude? He'd protected us in his own way. Outside came barking. Max. Ethan had arrived with the dog. I opened the trailer door. Ethan stood 30 feet away, holding Max by the collar. The dog was pulling forward with such force my son could barely hold on. David came out of the trailer, stopped on the threshold. Max froze, stopped pulling, stared at the man he hadn't seen in 4 years, recognizing. Then he howled, a long, drawn-out howl, not of threat, of joy, of recognition. Ethan let go of the collar. Max bolted toward David. A huge German shepherd, 70 pounds of muscle and fur, crashed into him, knocked him down, licked his face, whined, wagged his tail so hard his whole body writhed. David lay on the ground hugging the dog, crying, saying, "Good boy, Max. Good boy. You found me. You always knew." Ethan stood to the side, stared at the father he'd buried 3 years ago. Didn't approach, face like stone. Emily ran out of the trailer and threw herself at her brother, screaming that Dad was alive, that everything would be okay, that we were a family again. Ethan hugged his sister, didn't look at David. Police arrived 10 minutes later. Martha had called them, told them where we were. Detective Morrison got out of the car with 2 officers, saw Emily, alive, unharmed, and exhaled with relief. Saw David and froze, demanded ID. He showed a fake driver's license in the name Daniel Carter. His work security pass, all fake. Everything he'd lived under for 3 years. Morrison said he'd have to come to the station, give a statement, explain the staged death, document forgery. These were serious crimes. David nodded, said he understood, that he was ready for anything, that the important thing was we were safe. Morrison looked at me, asked if I wanted to press charges against him. I had the right. He'd deceived me, made me think I was a widow, took 3 years of my life. I looked at Emily, who was holding David's hand, at Ethan, who stood apart but was looking at his father, at Max, who sat at David's feet and never took his eyes off him, said I didn't know, that I needed time. They took David to the station. Emily cried, but I promised everything would be okay, that Dad would come back. I didn't know if that was true or a lie. They drove us home. Emily was fed, checked by a doctor. Physically, she was fine. A little dehydrated, scared, but whole. A psychologist said she'd need therapy. That for an 8-year-old child, this was trauma, searching for a dead father and finding him alive. But Emily didn't look traumatized. She was happy, said she'd known, that she'd always known Dad was somewhere out there, that she'd felt it. Children are sometimes wiser than adults. The next few days were chaos. Federal agents, detectives, lawyers. David gave testimony about the drug cartel, the debts, the threats. The prosecutor's office checked his story. The people he'd owed were indeed in prison. The FBI confirmed it. A major operation 6 months ago, 30 people arrested. Staging a death and forging documents were serious charges. But considering the circumstances, considering he'd protected his family from a real threat, the prosecutor was willing to make a deal. Probation instead of prison, a fine for the fake documents, community service. David agreed, said he'd pay whatever it took, would work until the end of his life if necessary. Martha wasn't prosecuted. An old woman tried to protect her son. The prosecutor felt she was punished enough by her guilt. Ethan didn't speak to David for 2 weeks. My 17-year-old son, who'd always been reserved, became even colder. Locked himself in his room. Didn't want to discuss it. Emily, on the other hand, wanted to see her father every day. Cried when I explained I couldn't just bring him home, that it was complicated, that adult problems don't get solved as simply as in children's books. Max was restless. The dog became anxious again, pulled on walks toward the warehouses. But David wasn't there anymore. He was forbidden from returning there under the terms of his bail release. David rented a small apartment in a cheap neighborhood. Found work at a construction site, the only thing he could get with his history of false documents. Paid his fines in installments. Asked permission to see the kids. I didn't know how to answer. Part of me wanted to banish him forever. He'd abandoned us, made me mourn, stole 3 years, didn't trust me enough to tell the truth. But another part understood. He'd protected us, the only way he knew how. He'd sacrificed himself, his life, his name, his family. Worked like a slave for 3 years to send money. Didn't forget us. Came back with a threat passed. The psychologist we went to as a family said there was no right answer. That I had to decide for myself. That the kids had to decide for themselves. That forgiveness was a process, not an event. A month after the reunion, I allowed David to meet with the kids. In a park, during the day, I'd be nearby. Neutral territory. Emily ran to him as soon as she saw him, hugged him, wouldn't let go. David picked her up and cried. Ethan stood apart, hands in pockets, face cold. David approached him, said he understood his anger, that he wasn't asking for forgiveness, that he just wanted his son to know he loved him, always had. Ethan was silent for a long time, then said, "You're dead to me," turned and walked away. David stood and watched him go. Didn't try to stop him. Understood he'd earned that. I brought Max to the next meeting. The dog barely waited for me to open the car door. Jumped out and bolted toward David. Leaped, licked, whined with happiness. David sat on the ground and hugged Max. They sat like that for 10 minutes. Man and dog. A reunion that required no words or explanations. The dog didn't judge, didn't blame, just rejoiced that his human had returned. I watched them and thought, maybe we should be more like dogs. Not complicate things, not hold grudges, just love those who love us. But people aren't dogs. We have pride, memory, pain. Months passed. David saw Emily once a week, took her to movies, to the park, for ice cream. Normal father-daughter things they'd been deprived of for 3 years. Emily blossomed, became more open, confident. The psychologist said the reunion with her father helped her more than any therapy. Ethan kept his distance. Didn't want to see David. I didn't force him. 17 is a difficult age. His father's betrayal hit him hardest. He was old enough to understand the complexity of the situation and young enough not to know how to forgive. But sometimes I noticed Ethan looking at old photos. David with him fishing. David teaching him to ride a bike. Happy times before the catastrophe. 6 months later, something happened that changed everything. Ethan got into an accident. Not serious, backed into a pole in the school parking lot. His own fault, distracted by his phone. The car was dented, but he was fine. I was at work, couldn't get there right away. Called David in a panic. He was closer, working at a construction site in that area. David arrived in 10 minutes. Ethan was sitting in the dented car, gripping the steering wheel, shaking. Shock, adrenaline, fear. David opened the door, pulled his son out of the car, hugged him. Ethan didn't push him away, just stood there shaking. David said everything was okay, that the important thing was he was alive, that cars can be fixed, but people can't, that he was there, that he wouldn't leave. Ethan broke, hugged his father, and cried. First time in 6 months. All his walls came down at once. When I arrived, they were sitting on the curb next to the dented car. Father and son, talking. Ethan told me later that he understood, that David hadn't abandoned them, that he'd come back, that dead men don't come back. But his father had. It wasn't forgiveness, not complete, but it was a beginning. A year passed. The trial concluded. David got 3 years probation, community service, installment payments on fines. Didn't go to prison. The prosecutor considered the circumstances, considered that he'd protected his family, considered that he'd cooperated fully. I found a new job, administrator at a hospital. Pays less than logistics, but it's stable. David still lives separately. We haven't reunited as a couple. I'm not ready. Maybe I never will be. Too much pain, too much lying, even if it was for protection. But he's part of the kids' lives, sees them twice a week, goes to Emily's school events, helped Ethan prepare for his SAT exams, was at his graduation. Max is happy. The dog got his human back. When David comes over, Max doesn't leave his side, follows him everywhere, puts his head on his lap, looks at him with devoted eyes. Sometimes I think Max saved us all. If the dog hadn't pulled toward the warehouses, hadn't howled, hadn't scratched doors, we would have been searching in the wrong place. Police were combing the park and surrounding areas. Emily was at the warehouses, 3 kilometers in the opposite direction. If Max hadn't broken free from Ethan's grip that third night, if he hadn't run toward the warehouses, my son wouldn't have seen where the dog was pulling, wouldn't have called me. I wouldn't have gone to Martha's, wouldn't have found the letters, wouldn't have learned the truth in time. Emily spent 2 days at the warehouses with David. But what if it had been 3, 4, a week? David panicking, not knowing what to do. Emily in the trailer, scared, hungry, police searching in the wrong place. Max knew. From the very beginning, the dog knew where to search. Animals sense things we don't. Sense on the wind, emotions, connections. Max remembered David 4 years later, recognized his scent from 30 kilometers away, tried to tell us the only way he could, by barking, howling, pulling toward the warehouses. We didn't listen. People think they're smarter than animals, that we know better. But sometimes we're wrong. Emily is 10 now. She writes essays in school about her family. Her teacher showed me one. Emily wrote, "My family is unusual. My dad was dead, but then he became alive. And our dog Max is a hero. He found my dad when everyone thought he was lost forever." A child's truth. Simple, honest, without complications. Ethan is in college now, studying veterinary medicine. says he wants to work with animals because they're more honest than people. David is proud of him, helps with studies however he can. Their relationship isn't what it was before the death, but it exists. That's already something. I'm still in the process of forgiveness, acceptance. I don't know what to call it. David doesn't ask to come back. Understands that some things can't be completely fixed. That his choice to stage his death instead of trusting me left scars. But we talk. Politely, sometimes warmly. We discuss the kids, their problems, their successes. We're not a couple, but we're partners in parenting. It's strange, but it works. Martha apologized to me many times. I forgave her. She loved her son and tried to protect everyone. It doesn't excuse the lies, but I understand. 2 years have passed since that October week when my daughter disappeared and my dead husband came back to life. I've learned a lot. That love is complicated. That protection can take ugly forms. That children are wiser than we think. That dogs know things we don't. Max is old now. 8 years old. For a German Shepherd, that's a respectable age. He runs slower, sleeps more. The fur on his muzzle is going gray. But when David comes over, Max becomes a puppy again. Jumps, barks, wags his tail with his whole body. The joy of reunion doesn't age. I watch them, the dog and the man, and think about what this story taught me. Max knew the truth for 3 years, smelled David's scent in the air on the old jacket Ethan wore, remembered the man who'd brought him home as a puppy. When David returned to Portland, Max sensed it first, before anyone knew. Before Emily overheard her grandmother's conversation, the dog knew his human was nearby. And when Emily disappeared, Max knew where to go. Not to the park where police were searching, to the warehouses where David lived, where the man who thought he was protecting his family by his absence was hiding. If we'd listened to the dog, everything would have been simpler. We would have found Emily on the first day. We would have learned about David immediately. There wouldn't have been 3 days of hell, fear, panic. But people don't listen to dogs. We think we know better. I look at Max now, an old dog dozing at my feet, and I know he's the hero of this story. Not me, not David, not even Emily with her childhood bravery. Max, the dog who remembered, who knew, who tried to tell us the only way he could. And in the end, we heard him. Sometimes in the evenings, we're all together. Me, David, the kids, Max. Not every day, once a month, for special occasions. Dinner at the house or a picnic in the park. A strange family, broken and glued back together. Emily is happy. She has both parents. Ethan is learning to accept his father back into his life. David is trying to make up for lost time. I'm learning to live with pain and forgiveness simultaneously. And Max lies between us all and dozes. He doesn't need explanations, apologies, complicated feelings. His people are together. His pack is whole. That's all that matters to a dog. Maybe we should all be a little more like Max. Think less, feel more. Judge less, accept more. Remember the pain less, value the moment more. 2 years ago, I thought I knew what loss meant. I'd mourned a dead husband for 3 years, then lost my daughter for 3 days, then learned the husband wasn't dead, that everything I'd known was a lie. But through that lie, I learned the truth, that family isn't a perfect picture, that love can be ugly and sacrificial, that forgiveness isn't an event, but a process that can last a lifetime. And that dogs are the most honest creatures on the planet. They don't know how to lie. They remember scents, voices, touches. They know who truly loves them, and they never give up. Max didn't give up. For 3 days he tried to tell us, pulled toward the warehouses, barked, howled, scratched doors, broke through a window, and ran off that last night when we were still searching in the wrong place. He led Ethan to the truth. He showed us the way. Sometimes salvation doesn't come from people. Sometimes heroes are those who can't speak human words, but speak the language of love, loyalty, and instinct. Max saved my daughter, saved my family, saved us all from a lie that could have lasted forever. And for that, I'm grateful to him every day for the rest of his life. Dogs know the truth. We just need to learn to listen. Last month, something happened that reminded me why Max will always be our hero. Ethan brought home a girl from college. Her name was Sophie, studying to be a veterinary nurse. They'd been dating for a few months, but this was the first time he'd brought her to meet the family. Max, who usually greeted strangers with polite indifference, took one look at Sophie and growled. Low, warning. The fur on his back stood up. Ethan was confused, said Max never acted like that. Sophie laughed nervously, said she was good with dogs, reached out her hand. Max backed away, still growling. I was about to apologize, say the dog was old and sometimes grumpy, when Max did something he'd never done before. He went to the front door, scratched it, then came back to Ethan, took his sleeve in his teeth and pulled, gently but insistently, pulled him away from Sophie. Ethan looked at me, uncertain. I thought about 3 years ago, about how Max had tried to tell us where Emily was, about how we hadn't listened until it was almost too late. I said quietly, Ethan, trust the dog. My son looked at Sophie, then at Max, said he needed to talk to his girlfriend outside for a minute. I don't know what they discussed, but when they came back 20 minutes later, Ethan was pale. Sophie was gone. He told me later, weeks later, after he'd processed it, that he'd asked her some direct questions, that she'd gotten defensive, then angry, then finally admitted the truth. She wasn't a veterinary nursing student. She'd looked up his family online after seeing the news stories from 2 years ago. Thought we might have money, the insurance settlement that had been mentioned in some articles. She'd targeted him deliberately. Max had known. Somehow, the dog had sensed her intentions weren't genuine. The same way he'd known David was alive. The same way he'd known where Emily was. Ethan knelt down and hugged Max that night. Told him he was sorry for ever doubting him, sorry for not listening sooner, all those years ago. The dog licked his face and wagged his tail. No budges, no I told you so, just love. David comes for dinner every Sunday now. It's become a routine. Not living together, not back to how we were, but family nonetheless. He brings groceries, helps cook, does dishes. Small acts of service. Ways to show he's here, he's present, he's not leaving again. Last Sunday, Emily asked him why he chose Max specifically. Of all the puppies at the oil rig, why that one? David was quiet for a moment, then said, because Max chose me. There were 6 puppies. 5 of them played together, tumbled over each other, ignored the humans. But Max walked right up to me, sat at my feet, and looked up at me. Like he was saying, I'm yours, take me home. He paused, scratched Max behind the ears. The dog's tail thumped against the floor. David continued, I knew I was going to leave you all soon. Knew I had to disappear, but I wanted to leave something of myself behind. Something that would protect you when I couldn't. Max was never just a pet. He was my promise that I'd come back. At some part of me would always be watching over you. Emily's eyes filled with tears. She hugged David tight. Ethan didn't say anything, but I saw him wipe his eyes. I stood at the kitchen sink, hands in soapy water, and let myself cry. For the first time in 2 years, I cried not from anger or pain, but from something else. Understanding, maybe, or the beginning of peace. Max saved us in ways we're still discovering. He kept David's presence alive in our home when we thought he was dead. He refused to let us forget. He pulled us toward the truth when we were determined to believe a lie. And now, in his old age, he still protects us, still knows things we don't, still speaks a language we're learning to understand. The vet says Max has maybe 2 more years. His hips are getting bad. Arthritis. The price of being a large breed. We give him medication, make sure he's comfortable, carry him upstairs when he can't manage them himself. David has started coming over more often, not just Sundays. Says he wants to spend time with Max while he can. They sit together in the backyard, man and dog, in comfortable silence. Sometimes David talks to him, tells him things he can't say to us yet. Max listens, head on his paws, understanding in his eyes. I know what will happen when Max goes. It will break us in a way David's death didn't, because Max's death will be real, final, no coming back. But for now, he's here, our guardian, our truth teller, our hero. Emily is writing a book for school, a true story, she calls it, The Dog Who Brought Dad Home. Her teacher says it's the best work any student has ever submitted. Wants to submit it to a young writers competition. Emily asked me if it was okay to tell our story, if the world should know. I said yes, because it's not a story about shame or secrets anymore. It's a story about love in its strangest, most complicated form. About sacrifice and survival. About the wisdom of animals and the foolishness of humans. And mostly, it's a story about Max. When people read it, I want them to understand. Sometimes the answers we're looking for aren't in our heads. They're not in logic or reason or adult wisdom. Sometimes they're in the howl of a dog at 3 in the morning, in the pull of a leash toward a place we don't want to go, in the scratch of paws on a door we refuse to open. The universe sends us guides in unexpected forms, messengers who speak without words, teachers with 4 legs and fur. Our job is to listen. I failed at that for 3 days. 3 days that felt like a lifetime. 3 days when my daughter was missing and a dog was screaming the answer, and I was too human, too proud, too convinced of my own intelligence to hear him. I won't make that mistake again. Now when Max whines at the door, I open it. When he pulls the leash in an unexpected direction, I follow. When he growls at someone, I pay attention. Because Max has earned my trust. Not by being perfect, but by being right when it mattered most. Last week, David asked me to coffee. Just the 2 of us. No kids, no Max, no buffer. I said yes. We sat in a cafe in downtown Portland, nursing our drinks, not quite looking at each other. He asked if I thought I'd ever forgive him completely, ever take him back. I was honest, said I didn't know, that some days I thought maybe, someday. Other days I remembered the funeral, the tears, The nights I couldn't sleep, the way I'd explained to our children that Daddy was never coming home. And I wanted to hate him all over again. He nodded, said he understood, that he'd live with that uncertainty for as long as it took, that he'd earned it. Then he said something that surprised me. Thank God for Max. I looked up at him. He explained, if Max hadn't found you, if that dog hadn't pulled Ethan toward the warehouses, hadn't broken free, hadn't refused to give up, I think Emily would have gone home eventually. I would have convinced her to. And I would have disappeared again. Changed cities, changed names, vanished for real this time. Because I was a coward, Sarah. I couldn't face you, couldn't face what I'd done. But Max didn't let that happen. Max made sure you found us. Made sure the truth came out. That dog did what I couldn't do. He brought us back together. We sat in silence after that. I thought about fate, about chance, about divine intervention, about a puppy chosen from a litter 4 years ago by a man who knew he was about to disappear, about how that puppy grew into a dog who refused to forget, who carried a promise in his bones. Maybe David had been right. Maybe Max was never just a pet. Maybe he was a bridge, a living connection between the man who left and the family who remained. Maybe some debts can only be repaid by animals who don't understand currency, who only understand love. I'm not ready to forgive David completely. Maybe I never will be. The human heart doesn't heal on a schedule. It doesn't follow logic or fairness or anyone else's timeline. But I'm grateful he came back. Grateful Emily found him. Grateful a dog knew what none of us did. And I'm trying. Every day. I'm trying. That's all any of us can do. Emily's book won 3rd place in the state competition. They invited her to read an excerpt at an award ceremony. She stood on stage, 10 years old, and read the final paragraph in a clear, strong voice. Some people think dogs are just pets. But Max isn't just a pet. He's a hero. He found my dad when everyone said Dad was dead. He knew the truth when all the grown-ups believed a lie. If you have a dog who's trying to tell you something, listen, because dogs don't lie. They just love us and try to save us, even when we're too stubborn to be saved. The audience applauded. I saw parents wiping their eyes, teachers nodding, and David, sitting next to me, put his face in his hands and wept. That night, we all went home together. All of us. It wasn't permanent. David still lived in his apartment, still kept his distance. But for one night, we pretended we were whole. Max lay in the center of the living room, kids on either side of him, David and me on opposite ends of the couch. We watched a movie none of us paid attention to, and for the first time in 3 years, our house felt like home. Not because everything was fixed, not because the pain was gone, but because we were together, in the same room, breathing the same air, connected by a dog who'd refused to let us break apart permanently. I don't know what the future holds. If David and I will ever be a couple again, if Ethan will ever fully trust his father, if Emily will grow up and realize how much more complicated this story is than her child's heart understands. But I know this. Max saved us. Not just Emily, not just from 3 days of terror, but from years of lies, from a fractured family that could have stayed broken forever. He saved us by refusing to give up, by barking when we wanted silence, by pulling when we wanted to stay still, by breaking free when we tried to hold him back. He saved us by being exactly what he was, a dog who loved his family more than comfort, more than obedience, more than his own safety. And when Max's time comes, and it will come, sooner than I want to think about. I'll hold him as he goes. I'll whisper in his ear all the things he already knows. That he was good, that he was brave, that he was the best of us. That he brought us home when home seemed lost forever. That we heard him, finally, when it mattered most. Dogs know the truth. And if we're lucky, if we're wise, if we're humble enough to admit we don't have all the answers, we learn to listen.